Our third speaker this afternoon is Dr. Cheryl Kalisch, who's the Trade and Economics Manager from Grain Growers Limited. Cheryl has represented Australian grains in regional comprehensive economic partnership and trans-Pacific partnership negotiations, advocating for Australian grains with respect to the North Asian trade agreements of CAFTA and the Japanese Free Trade Agreement. And she also has an ongoing interest in a family farm in the central west of New South Wales. So please welcome our third speaker, Dr. Cheryl Kalisch.
Thanks, Nick, for the introduction and for the opportunity to speak today. Thanks also to Alan and to Bob for their remarks and setting the scene on trade. I'd like now to bring that to life in the context of our Australian grain sector, and in doing so we'll be picking up on some of the elements that have been brought to this discussion already. We have an international industry, our Australian grains industry, and it's an industry which annually produces around 45 million tonnes of wheat, barley, oats, sorghum, canola and pulses. It's worth about $13.5 billion at the farm gate alone. Our exports are $33 million tonnes annually. That's about 70% of production, and that returns around $11.4 billion in export value annually. And it is an industry that generates more than 170,000 jobs across rural, regional and metropolitan Australia. Typically, around 50% of the grain that is sold domestically is into the livestock feed sector, and primarily, or at least half, to the highly export-oriented dairy and beef sectors. So therefore, if you take a grain such as wheat, our largest production crop in Australia, around 85% of that annual production ends up on international markets in some form or another. In some regions of Australia, such as Western Australia, that often exceeds 90%. However, on the world stage, Australia is a very small player. In terms of production, Australia produces just 1 to 2% of the international grain harvest. And even in terms of wheat, our biggest crop, we account for just 3 to 4% of global production. When it comes to trade volumes, Australia does account for 10 to 15% of wheat trade, but this is still a modest level. Like most Australian agricultural industries, our future is dependent on performance in the export sector, where we are small players. This degree of exposure to international markets will be maintained and likely amplified into the future. Forecasts place the growth in the domestic grain milling and processing sector to be driven only by population growth. Our population isn't increasing its bread and noodle consumption, and in fact we're actually declining our consumption of beer. So growth in the Australian grain output beyond about 2% will need to be absorbed by domestic animal feed industries or sold into international markets. Either way, our international exposure will be increased into the future. In this international market, Australian grain farmers have been operating at a disadvantage to grain farmers in other origin suppliers nations for many years. Australian grain farmers operate in a totally deregulated domestic and export market and with no market support. This is in stark comparison to other grain producing nations. Producer support equivalents as calculated by the OECD show this reality. In 2015, EU farmers received around 20% of their income as a result of government policy and programs. In China, it was over 20%, and in North America, US and Canada, it was around 10%. With the exception of nations such as China, who have more recently increased support, we must recognise that this is a far better situation than the much higher levels and the much more distortionary types of support that were afforded to grain production in the 1980s and 1990s. And this feature of lower support worldwide has been critical to our industry. However, the level of support for grain production remains high. More than 50% of the grain produced around the world is supported to the tune of about 17%, if we take into account the countries noted on the board. This means that for 50% of the grain produced internationally, Australian grain is at about a disadvantage of $20 to $30 a tonne before it even leaves the farm. And that only accounts for grain from China, the EU and North America. Russia and India, also large grain players, also have very distorted grain markets. The effect of these distortions is to deliver additional grain supply from net exporters into international markets, putting downward pressure on prices, but also reduce import demand from net importers of grain, whose demand would otherwise put upward pressure on prices. And this is what we've seen. Growing production and growing stocks, and of course growing supply plus dampened demand equals depressed prices. In what might be seen as a disingenuous approach, considering they support their farmers to the tune of 10% of their annual income, a recent US study of the impact of Chinese support for wheat production in excess of their WTO commitments found global losses as a result of less trade and lower prices to be some $3.3 billion US annually, including $250 million in losses to Australia alone. So sure, the massive expansion in plantings internationally as a response to high prices around that 2008, those 2008 years, a good run of good years in most supply nations and technology gains have contributed to the record grain stocks we see now. But high, and in some cases growing, levels of domestic support have exacerbated and will prolong the period of oversupply. Low prices cannot be left to solve low prices where distortions are at play in the market. Despite this very sobering picture of the disadvantage our grain faces in international markets, our grains remain in demand internationally, and our volumes and value of production and exports continue to grow. And returns to grain farmers have been above those in other agricultural sectors, and achieving decent returns for the most part over recent years. This is no accident. It is the result of innovation and productivity in grains. It is the result of there being good functional value in our grains for buyers, as well as good fortune that there has been growth in international markets for grains, especially in our region. Operating in a competitive international market, our grain farms have been required to grow their operations and be smarter with innovative new technologies such as no-till, water use efficiency changes, and precision agriculture and variable input application methods. They're ever chasing lower costs of production to remain competitive, whilst maintaining the functionality, consistency, and reliability of our grains. This is the reality of free trade: more production with fewer inputs. But it does require change. Our industry has responded to the efficiency challenges that free markets bring and responded accordingly. However, all of this has been while our grain has been competing with artificially lower international prices for grain due to the trade distorting policies elsewhere in the world. The prices received and volumes being sold are therefore lower than the levels that allow Australian grain farmers to optimally invest in research and innovation and ensure they have sufficient reserves for years of adverse conditions. The bilateral trade agreements achieved for Australia over recent years have been significant for our sector because the preferential tariff reductions go some, though not all the way, to redressing that uneven playing field. The removal of tariffs on Australian grains in markets such as China, the ASEAN region, and South Korea support the competitiveness of Australian grain against government-supported grain supply. For example, as a result of the entry into force of the China Free Trade Agreement, our sorghum avoids the imposition of 2% tariff on import. Currently worth around $6 to $7 per tonne in the market, where margins are thin, that's important. For barley, the benefit of chapter to Australia is around $9 a tonne in the current market. Where shipping a tonne of grain from the Pacific Northwest to China is currently around $16 a tonne, these are important costs, the cost of tariffs, to be preferentially removed from Australian grains and make a difference in the calculations of buyers importing shiploads of grain. Australia's trade agreement with the ASEAN group of nations does likewise for Australian wheat, being considered for purchase in the strongly growing market of Vietnam. As of this year, Australian grain avoids a 5% import tariff, worth around $15 in today's market. The value of tariff eliminations is not only to remove cost of grain, a cost from the Australian grain relative to alternatives, it also allows the intrinsic values of the grain to be more transparent to buyers. When you remove a tariff from a product, the contributing value components of the product become a greater part of the buying consideration. For Australian grain, well known for its safety and reliability, as well as its superior milling and baking and noodle making properties in the case of wheat, and malting properties in the case of barley, this is truly important. Where quality considerations have greater prominence in a buying decision, the value of Australian grains have the chance to shine through. I have very deliberately avoided the term free in reference to these agreements, even though most of them have free in their actual titles. There are a few reasons for that. Firstly, there are exceptions in these agreements. Even if you just consider our sector, there are omissions that means our grains do not trade freely. Australian wheat and canola are still trading into China at the most favoured nation WTO tariff of 1% and 9%, respectively, and subject to the WTO tariffs, quotas. Under the Japanese-Australia Economic Partnership Agreement, Australian milling wheat and malting barley must still be imported via government purchase processes and a complicated markup system. Secondly, agreements generally include initiatives to manage technical barriers to trade, but with no demonstrated success so far and no guarantees. The global trend of increasing technical barriers to trade can be more problematic than tariffs because of the uncertainty that they bring into commercial transactions. For our sector, technical barriers are manifest as sanitary and phytosanitary requirements not being based on science, differences in testing regimes at ports of receival, and intermittent and untimely changes in standards and procedures. The impact of these is to introduce additional risk, so traders think twice about a market and offer lower bid prices to grain growers, through to actively avoiding markets or not being able to service the market at all. Non-tariff measures can be as limiting to free trade and sometimes more so than tariffs. And the third reason I don't use free in reference to these agreements is that bilateral and regional trade agreements do not deliver free trade because they do not offer commitments on domestic policy and support. Domestic policy and structural reform is really the crucial bit of the puzzle that completes the free trade story. And it's this crucial point that has gone missing in the trade conversation of recent years. Domestic policy and structural reform must go hand in hand with the removal of tariffs to truly underpin the benefits of free trade. This is the part of the conversation that helps us understand why anti-trade sentiment has been able to grow itself and find itself as a key issue in the UK, the US, and even our own politics. There are two sides to the free trade coin. The benefits of free trade at the economy-wide and global perspectives are generated from the increased purchasing power of consumers as relatively more efficiently produced imports become available. But more importantly, it is the greater wealth that is created as the factors of production are moved or redistributed within the economy to enterprises or production of goods and services of higher value. And that includes the possibility that land will be used for different purposes and labour moved to different jobs and capital to flow to different industries. At a pragmatic, on-the-ground level, this translates to the availability of cheaper TVs, food, cars and clothing on one side, but perhaps having to move or change jobs on the other. The current and rising anti-trade sentiments are a result of the structural change side of free trade being mismanaged or ignored. If governments and economies do ignore and mismanage the other side of the free trade coin, and you don't accept the need for structural change, you will get regions of unemployment, and you will also get adverse outcomes that will affect not only your domestic economy, but also other economies. A contemporary grain example is that of the Chinese domestic support of corn, wheat and rice production, which has continued and increased after China has begun to liberalise its grain imports. The result has been the Chinese acquiring significant and now deteriorating grain stocks, an unsustainable budget impost, artificially high prices in the short term, and in the longer term contributes to depressed international grain prices. In the face of a massive stockpile and huge budget outlay, there will be those in China with growing anti-trade sentiment. But it's not anti-trade sentiment they should have. It's that domestic policy change has not kept pace with liberalisation of trade at the border. So am I saying that the bilaterals that our government has been pursuing are not worthwhile? Absolutely not. And why? Because our economy is the opposite. It has already been restructuring and has been undergoing microeconomic reform for 40 years. The other side of the coin for Australia and for Australian grain farmers is the removal of tariffs in our markets. So our efficiently produced grains have a greater chance of being competitive on the world market. Should we pursue preferential access for our grains? Absolutely. And in fact, grain farmers who have been long unshielded from competitive markets need the best possible chance to be competitive. Australian grain farmers, and in fact all Australian farmers, are owed the other side of the free trade coin. They've gone through the change, the restructure, and are now owed the best competitive pass into markets. But the benefits of preferential access may only last so long, until such time as the bilateral deals involving other nations deliver equal access. And it's only so long that our farmers can survive on thin margins. Without adequate returns to the resources employed, our farmers cannot invest optimally in research and technology, invest in supply chains, put away for periods of adverse conditions, and they cannot be thriving businesses that have made it through Australia's structural reform agenda and are now the backbones of rural, regional communities. And so the pursuits of the WTO must be maintained and strengthened where politically possible, because bilateral trade agreements and even plurilateral agreements cannot optimally incorporate reductions in domestic support. Only through multilateral trade negotiations can meaningful reductions in domestic support and the accompanying restructuring of domestic economies be promoted. So we must encourage a future for the WTO. But can we expect the WTO to achieve multilateral progress quickly? Firstly, we need to consider how the remit of the WTO has changed. Not only has the number of countries involved grown significantly, but the coverage and complexity of the issues have grown. There are frustrations with the WTO and its apparent sluggish performance on the back of the Doha round. However, just because something is slow to materialise does not mean it's not a worthwhile pursuit. But more fundamentally, and if we return back to the two sides of the free trade coin, we must recognise that big changes in quick succession are difficult in the WTO because the structural reform I've been talking about does take time. Take, for example, India. India has not been alone in making the Doha round of WTO difficult, but it is one of the more notable ones. It is a very palpable example of where patience is necessary. India cannot liberalise its tariffs on imports quickly because tariffs are one of the key sources of government revenue. So until the government has completed the implementation of a GST, which they're currently doing, and no mean feat, I imagine this to be in a country of 1.3 billion people, 2/3 of which are subsistence farmers, and a bureaucracy much more intricate than ours. Until they've got that in place, we can expect the Indian government to be slow on the move to WTO initiatives. Similarly, in China, after nearly a decade of increasing farmer support, this year the Chinese have begun dismantling their grain support programs. However, with between 80 and 400 million peasants living in poverty in China, depending on whose measure you use, and generations who still recall the famine of the late 1950s and early 1960s, untangling domestic policies of self-sufficiency in support of rural farmers will take time. So what do we need to do in the meantime? And what do grain growers members want? Our members want Australia to take chances where we can and seize preferential access agreements where we can. For those who have emerged as efficient grain producers, we need to give them every opportunity to be their competitive best in the world market. In Bob's words, our members would like the government to put 1,000% behind them. Our members also recognise the need to capitalise on opportunities and secure our market access with a strong grains industry position in existing and new markets. Preferential access does not mean markets are won. It is a critical first step, a door opening if you will, but not the done deal. Australia needs a sustainable and coordinated support function for grains in the international market to encourage and technically support Australian grain sales, a function that has been missing since the deregulation of the AWP. Our sector also needs Australia to continue to back the WTO and initiatives to further reduce domestic support of agricultural production. To this end, Grain Growers is pleased that the CANS Group has reconvened in Geneva this week with the formation of a forward work program. Also on the WTO, we need support for and strengthening, not only in terms of commitments of, also on the WTO, we need support for and strengthening of its dispute resolution process. This will ensure that agreements are meaningful, not only in terms of commitments on tariffs and quotas and domestic support, but also commitments to the use of non-tariff barriers to trade. And finally, we need to hope, crossing all our fingers and toes, that the anti-trade sentiment that has manifested itself, particularly in the US election, doesn't play out as a retaliatory trade war, because small exporting nations like Australia, industries like our grain sector and our farmers will be the losers as growth slows in a world of growing protectionism.